Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and thank you for the organisers of this conference for inviting me to speak. Indeed, the liberalisation of international financial and commodity markets, which in the late 19th century prized open markets which had hitherto maintained strict control over foreign investment and currency exchange, ushered in a period of unprecedented increase in the flows of trade, investment, and immigration, both illegal and legal. The latter, however, increased dramatically as many countries failed to appreciate that it is virtually impossible to open their gates to goods, but not to people. The collapse of communism, which followed 10 years later, was more spectacular. What many believed to have been a colossus turned out to have feet clay. Its collapse triggered a huge rise in the shadow economy. It also resulted in a very uneven distribution of wealth and the opening up of borders which had been sealed and now proved only too porous, not just to legal trade, but to arms, drugs, terrorism, and prostitution rings. In the early 1990s, I remember writing a piece on the Moroccan GDP and looking for the first time at 1/3 of this GDP, which was not accounted for in official figures. This was not done to explain anything to do with hashish, nor with any idea of criminalizing this part of the Moroccan economy, but simply I was trying to understand how this worked, because the official figures we had did not tell the whole story. At the Financial Times, where I was then, a number of colleagues were being encouraged to write about this shadow economy, and this is when we started to write the first articles about drugs running in Latin America and so on and so forth. But the rise in money laundering and criminal activity, I don't think in the late 80s and early 90s, when we started writing about that we ever imagined that it might actually come to undermine the capitalist system itself and seriously compromise the benefits of globalization. But that is exactly what has happened, and on a scale which is still not really acknowledged either by governments or academics. Academics hardly ever talk about this subject. Such activities are all too often the preserve of sensationalist reporting. As I say, academics have devoted thousands of books into understanding the licit process of globalization, what is quantifiable and regulated, but have shied away from the shadow economy. So has the IMF and the World Bank. When I turn my attention to these activities, which account for so many jobs in Morocco and elsewhere, as I said, my intention was not to look for something criminal. It was simply trying to understand what was going on. Now, if one looks at the South Atlantic, which is my purpose here, one can just point to 2 or 3 examples and how these flows work. In the case of Morocco, the figures are not very great, and Morocco is a state which is well constituted, which manages its territory, so whatever problems there might be are manageable. This is not the case as you move to other parts of Africa, or indeed of Latin America. So I think that if you look at, for instance, on the Atlantic seaboard, I will take Nigeria, Brazil, and Colombia. Nigeria is plagued by the colonialist legacy, the curse of oil, and modern confessional tensions. It demonstrates how problematic is the application of universal policies in a world that boasts such diverse cultures. The mixed messages that emanate from America and Europe further exacerbate this. On the one hand, these countries encourage transparency and good governance in the developing world by applying a system of conditionality which includes both punishment and incentives. On the other hand, they are desperate to secure energy supplies from countries like Nigeria and much of the Arab world, and are prepared to bend the rules, especially when confronted by the competitive pressure of Chinese and Indian oil requirements. If the Americans and Europeans demand that oil-producing countries adopt higher standards of transparency, these countries are in a position to say, we have plenty of energy buyers, thank you very much. The speed with which Nigerian fraudsters have demonstrated a capacity in recent years to blend an advanced understanding of technology with a convincing theatricality far surpasses the cumbersome way in which governments negotiate trade and other agreements, which they are unable to police effectively. The advance free Ford, otherwise known as the 419 scam, is Nigeria's signature tune. It is through this means that people in Nigeria defrauded a Brazilian bank, the Banco del Noroeste, of hundreds of millions of dollars a few years ago. This was a leading Brazilian bank, and it is a quite extraordinary story which is not well known, a good example of transatlantic cooperation. But let me turn now to Brazil, a democracy whose economic progress and political progress in recent years has been very good news indeed. How many of you are aware that Sao Paulo has become the cybercrime capital of the world? Invading computers is a highly developed art today, and it is not just your bank account that is at risk, it's your entire identity which can be seized. In 2005, global losses attributable to identity theft, which are obviously not just managed out of Sao Paulo, stood at $50 billion plus. It is the profound divisions that lie at the heart of Brazil which explain this very powerful criminal network. As you seek to build links with Brazil, one has to be reminded of some of these awkward facts. Finally, a few words about cocaine, which transits from Latin America to Africa, through West Africa, and then into Europe. You in Morocco are well appraised of the dangers, as you have made efforts to avoid that Morocco become a route for this. But where is the cocaine going through? Will it move further west? How will it come to Europe? And I think this poses some very simple problems of states cooperating. It goes without saying that illicit trade, immigration, and terrorism work hand in hand. Now, what is true on the Atlantic front is true elsewhere in the world. There's nothing particularly original. I would, however, try to conclude on a note of optimism. If we look at the Atlantic seaboard, we can see many opportunities for increased trade and cross-fertilization of ideas. But the seaboard is porous, extremely porous. It is very difficult to police unless nations work together much more closely. As for land frontiers, they should be settled, recognized internationally, and secured wherever possible. And this is a problem on the African front, there's no doubt. A final point. Morocco, and it's already been said, does sit between the Atlantic, Africa, and the Mediterranean. The worldwide upsurge in trade, investment, and creation of wealth in recent years has been unprecedented. It has, for the time being, slowed down or stopped growing. This is maybe the right moment to take stock of what has happened, of what we have not done properly, and appreciate that if greater efforts are not made to regain control of money flows, arms trading, prostitution rings, illegal immigration, etc., the next shift in international relations, not least amongst the countries of the Atlantic seaboard, could well favor even more the growth of organized crime. The new circumstances which pertained after the fall of communism bewildered old international institutions. Everybody had to improvise, and nobody quite understood the implication of their actions. The calls we all too often hear for the greater engagement of police or military alone betray a profound abdication of political responsibility. This lack of vision or interest to address the great structural inequalities in the global economy, and particularly in the Atlantic, and within individual countries, helps criminals to build their networks. Instability thrives. In recent years, we've witnessed a hostile United States, a barely competent European Union, a cynical Russia, and an indifferent Japan, and an Arab world which basically is in absentia. This maybe can be changed. Today we have the unstoppable rise, well described yesterday, of China, but also of India, all of which has ushered in a golden age for global cooperation, but also transnational crime. If you can bring face to face the interests of people on the Atlantic, of major countries on the Atlantic seaboard, but also address the real challenges they face, you will, I am sure, be able to build a new nexus of exchange worthy of the challenging times we live in. Thank you very much.